Welcome. My name is Liz Stewart. I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins, and I'm on the board of the Society for Research on Educational Effectiveness. So it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, which is the second in a series we're doing on with methods webinars. I will give a little plug for that right now, just from a SREE perspective. We have this one today, which I'll talk about more in a second, with Brooks Bowden. And then I will just mention that we have another one coming up pretty soon on Tuesday, July 28th, also at noon. And that one is on Bayesian interpretation of impact estimates from education evaluations with John Dickey and Marielle Finucane from Mathematica. So we're hoping that this series will cover some important methodological topics relevant to education research, in particular sort of causal inference and evaluation in education. So let me jump right into today's speaker then, so I can mute myself and you don't hear the traffic. So I'm thrilled to have Brooks Bowden here today, talking with us today about cost effectiveness. And one reason I think probably we have a great attendance count here today is that this is highly relevant, as I'm sure any of you who submit Institute of Education Sciences research grants knows IES has been putting increased attention on this topic and is expecting more focus on this in their proposals, and we'll hear more about that as we go along. So that's partly why we wanted to do this one now in early mid-July, to help people with August IES submissions, and then also just to learn more generally for the field. So Brooks, just as a tiny bit of background on her, is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania and is the director of training at the Center for Benefit Cost Studies in Education. So you can see really the best person to be here presenting for us. One other thing I'll flag, and you can keep an eye, this is late breaking news, but she and her team were just recently awarded funding for an IES methods training program in cost effectiveness. So you can maybe think about this webinar as step one, but sounds like there's going to be plenty of other opportunities to learn more on this topic as time goes by. So without further ado, I will hand it on over to Dr. Bowden, and she can tell us all about cost effectiveness analysis. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Liz. All right, well, thanks everybody for sharing your Friday afternoon with me. Bear with me, sometimes with these controls I get a little lost in it, but I think we should work out okay. So thanks for joining, and we're going to talk today about cost and cost effectiveness, specifically within the frame of designing studies and ways to think about various questions and various kinds of studies that we're doing, largely mapped onto the IES goal structure, really with that August deadline in mind. Now, with that said, right, I cannot cover all the things. Unfortunately, we only have an hour and a half together, so I really sort of laser focused in on thinking about what different proposals should include or could include, and providing some ideas to help encourage you to sort of think through how you might incorporate costs into your own proposal. Okay, so with that, let's move ahead. So a lot of you might already be familiar with this, but it's important to start at this really basic threshold of thinking about the need for economic evaluation so that we consider why we're doing this in the study, right? Now, some of us might want to say like, oh, we're including costs because IES says I have to, but I promise you your proposal is going to be stronger, your work is going to be stronger if you can take a step back and think from the time of justification what this is adding to your study and why this is important. So when we think about replication, right, we think about the fact that we're producing information so that someone else can replicate, or that someone else can deliver and hopefully replicate what we find in our studies in practice. And I don't believe that there's any reason for us to expect replication to be successful without information on what it is that they need to replicate. So a major piece of the responsibility that falls on us as researchers is to consider in our trials and consider in our research providing the types of information that's necessary so that someone could come along after you and either have a sense of how you delivered the program to produce impact so that they could deliver it the same way in their school, or how they might deliver the program in the same way to try to replicate your effects. Now, as we think about our current context and the need for this work in our audience, right? Our audience is also really important, and you're going to hear that theme throughout our discussion today. We know that with the pandemic and everything that's going on, resource constraints are just continuing to get just worse and worse. We know that school systems and districts and principals, decision makers broadly speaking, they're also facing a level of student need and complexity of the issues that students are facing is also increasing. So here we have a situation where they're going to depend on us, right, as the researchers, to provide them with the information that they need to select among alternatives, to use the scarce resources that they have available to them to best serve their students. So that's the big underpinning reason for why we want to be thinking about this and what we should be considering when we think about our audience and the usefulness of this work. It's really important to remember those pieces and to not allow yourself to like get really caught up in the sort of negative spin, right, that cost or cost effectiveness might get, where it sounds like the intention is to cut costs or the intention is to cut resources. That's absolutely not the point of what we're talking about today. What we're talking about today is how do we successfully serve the students in our system, and how are we resourcing those classrooms, those teachers, those providers, those different scenarios in a way that we can do that successfully. Okay, so when we talk about costs, okay, we're talking about costs in terms of all resources to deliver an approach to achieve an effect. This allows us then to put costs and effects together in a couple of different economic metrics. So one is a cost effectiveness ratio, where we have the cost to produce an effect. And then the other is a benefit cost ratio, where we take those effects, we monetize them into economic benefits, and we're able to look at benefits and costs together. These two ratios, they support selecting among alternatives. So when we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about effects or goals or alternatives so that we're all sort of working with the same language. But the idea here is that a decision maker is facing any number of different new technologies or innovations or programs or whatnot to address a specific goal. And this information can be used to help them understand not just what program or what approach is the most effective, but the resources that were involved in producing that effect. So again, it's just the cost to replicate an impact. And here, when we're thinking about impacts or we're thinking about goals, I want us to think broadly so that we're capturing all of the different types of research that we're all trying to do. So in terms of a measurement study, there is a goal, there is an output there where we think about a student being assessed for a particular skill in a valid way that produces information that is helpful so that we can better serve that student and other students like them. There's also a development pilot, right? And in that scenario, we're thinking about improving practice or innovating so that we improve student outcomes. For an efficacy trial, it's a little bit more controlled, it's a little bit bigger, right? We're thinking, does a program produce the effects as intended? Generally when implemented under highly controlled conditions. Now highly, right, I'm using that loosely, but that's generally what an efficacy trial looks like. We're highly involved in the schools or the settings where our interventions are taking place. And replication trials are similar. Now an effectiveness trial or a scale-up trial is often with similar goals, but just at much larger scale and with much less interventions like support and control. So regardless, each of these has an outcome or an output or an effect. That's the goal of the work that's being done, right? So kind of keep that in mind as we talk through the different approaches today. So now let's put that into context with costs. So from a measurement perspective, we're thinking about the cost to deliver the assessment, development, right? Cost to deliver this innovative approach, efficacy and effectiveness, cost to produce effects. Now, one piece that's really critical that underlies all of this and how you frame your study and how you think about how costs could be an informative, integrated piece into your work is this question of what is business as usual? What are you changing? And so here, from a measurement perspective, it might be that the current assessment tool isn't really valid, or maybe it really doesn't get at some of the outcomes or some of the skills or behaviors that we know are really important for our students. It might be from a effectiveness perspective. It might be that business as usual is not really very systematic, and the program that we're evaluating offers a systematic approach to providing a certain type of service or educational program. This aspect of what is business as usual is critical to our studies because it's what we're comparing this new innovation or this existing practice to. So the more we can be clear about that, the better our work, the more informative our work will be, but it also helps us in our cost study as well. As we started to think about our audience and who we're informing, it helps to think about what choice are we informing in this process, right? We want to improve children's skills, but we're also sending this information out into the world. IES is placing a lot of emphasis now on dissemination, so that the information that we're learning and what we're producing is useful and taken up by others and learned and expanded upon by others. So in that process, I encourage you to think about whose choice you're informing, right? So is this a district's choice of which assessment to use? Is this a researcher's choice on which assessment to use? Is this a principal's choice on which after-school program to implement? So in those cases, that can help you to think about what practices you're changing so that you can be clear about that in your proposal. So we've already gone through a little bit of this, but generally alternatives apply to all aspects of the work that we're doing in education, and generally speaking, that's funded by IES. I did mean to say in the beginning that while I do receive funding from IES, I don't represent IES. So what I'm sharing with you today is really my perspective, my experience from about a decade of work in this area, and then building upon Hank Levin's work, which has been ongoing since the late 60s. So this really is intended to help you along as you're doing your proposals and not really from IES directly. So as we think about this, right, as you're developing a new measurement tool, or as you're developing a new program or innovative approach, as you're piloting that new approach, right, or as you're testing the efficacy of a promising approach, right, we're always generally thinking of what we're changing. In our justification, we talk about why this is important. We talk about where things are failing right now. And so these alternatives can be baked into sort of how you're thinking about that. And that helps you to think about what you're going to compare this program to or this assessment to, who you're going to inform with this information. Okay, so the cost piece. And I know we're moving fast, we have to move fast. It's just going to keep going like that. The cost piece, the ingredients method is a way that you can estimate your costs for any of these given types of research, any of these types of questions. We did put out a new edition of the book a few years ago, and that book really walks you through kind of in detail, like any textbook, how you would conceptualize costs, but then how you would attach prices and adjust prices. And it helps you think through that actual like dollar value of resources piece to this. And then it also helps you think through that economic metric piece of a cost effectiveness ratio or a benefit cost ratio. We do not have time for any of that today. What we do have time for today is thinking about the resources, thinking about what you already know in your proposal development and how you can integrate costs into that process. So super quickly, with the ingredients method, you identify and measure changes in resources. You want to make sure that you capture the resources that are directly involved in a program. You want to capture resources maybe that have to be purchased for the program, but you also want to capture resources that are more invisible or that are donated coming from volunteers. Then we price those ingredients. Because IES is intended to inform a national audience, right? So are most of our major national journals. Using a national average price allows your cost information to be separated from particular local differences. It also allows you to, and some of you will be doing trials where you have schools in different locations, and it allows you to sort of control for the differences in those local markets. So here I do not have time to go into this more, but I'm more than happy to follow up with you. There are other videos online too that can help you with this process. But generally speaking, we recommend using a national standardized price to reflect the market value of these different inputs. You use that to just calculate the overall cost. I mean, at this point, we're multiplying a price by a quantity, and then we're totaling the total cost, and then we take an average cost per student. Now, what's really important here is because we're producing a total cost estimate, where we're thinking from an opportunity cost perspective about all the costs that are involved in producing either a child who's assessed or a child who's better off in some skill set, or an adult. We also want to include the component of considering who pays. So this component is important because it allows us to think not just here's the total cost, but of those total costs, what costs are borne by the school, what costs are borne by volunteers, and different sources like that. I'll walk through some examples quickly today as we move through the different goal structure, but there are some resources that are available on that one. And then what IES is also including in some of their RFA recommendations is to think about cost effectiveness, specifically that metric, so the cost divided by effects. So here, that would allow you to compare your findings to other research that's been published. So just like you might consider in your conclusion section to say, you know, I found an effect of 0.1 on 5th graders reading comprehension, then you might put that into context with other evaluations of 5th grade reading comprehension, and you would talk about that together. So in this case, you could talk about the costs and the effects, the cost effectiveness ratio, and you could put that into context with the literature that's available. So that's just a plan that you can set out in your proposal. There are standards available to estimate costs. These are listed in the textbook, but they're available just generally also through other work. We do recommend this perspective of opportunity cost and meaning that all inputs, right? Because we're thinking about replication. We're thinking about producing an outcome, producing an effect, and the resources that go into producing that effect. So that sort of production function mind frame is going to be throughout what we talk about today. It's also important to clarify the program's theory and components, right? How the program changes the resources in practice. You want to separate quantity from price. Provide total and distribution of costs across agents. Be transparent. You're going to have to make assumptions. There's going to be aspects of your implementation or ways that costs might vary that you are not able to completely cover in your study, and that is normal. We all have scope limitations. What's important is that we be clear about that so that when someone else picks up our work, we can say, we did a very large study that covered hundreds of classrooms. We know about resources at more of like an aggregated level, so we used an average class size to reflect the class sizes across our sample. And in that case, like let's say we used a class size of 25. Well, let's say someone comes and they pick up your work and they say, well, my class sizes are 30. So that might help them to sort of reframe how they look at the costs that go into delivering this particular approach so that they can think through your assumptions. This is also important in terms of the quantity and price piece. So we separate quantity from price so that we can understand not just the cost value of a particular set of resources, but so that we can say, well, we need 100 teachers, and the 100 teachers need to attend 1 day of training. And then the 100 teachers each spent approximately 20 minutes per week preparing for the lessons that they delivered. that's the kind of information that we need about those resources in order to replicate, that goes in tandem with the cost information. But keeping quantity and price separate allows any user of your work to say, well, forget their prices. You know, I want to put in my own local prices to think about the feasibility of doing this. So it just sort of allows them with the opportunity to do that. Okay, so sort of a hallmark of this method is you're going to see this worksheet, right? It's in the textbook. It's been present in Professor Levin's work since the 1975 chapter, I believe. And in it, it's just a list of ingredients. It's intended to include descriptions, especially when there are characteristics or qualifications or trainings that are important to understand the input and the relationship between that input and the outcome. We have quantity unit, right? Basic stuff here. All right, so let's keep going. Let's talk about how we are going to integrate this information into your proposal. Good proposals. This is basic stuff. This is not just about costs, but in my work on costs, it's helped me to think through how we can tell a better story, how we can be more sort of coherent or cohesive in the stories that we're telling with our proposals and with our work in general. Reviewers like to see proposals that flow together. They connect the different aspects of the literature to the questions, to the methods, right? Everything sort of flows together to show that this study will contribute important new knowledge. Now, most proposals include a justification, a research plan, and personnel. We'll talk briefly about those. But what I really highly recommend is designing the study so that these components are not separate, right? You want to show your reader that this wonderful thing that you're planning to evaluate, how you're going to do that in a way that each component builds upon each other so that you have really fruitful, useful, interesting findings. Okay, so in the design overview, okay, I'm going to give you a sense of like which piece of your proposal you're talking about, and then give you a sense of how you could work in a cost or economic framework, with the goal of having the cost piece threaded throughout your proposal. What I don't want to see is, here's a proposal that's completely structured, and then here's a section on costs. Okay, there's one big takeaway from this, it's to think about how you might integrate that throughout your proposal. And you're probably already doing it. This is like a small tweak in perspective. Okay, so when you set out your problem, right, or you think about the need for this work and how you're connecting that then to the framework for the evaluation, often in our proposals, we are talking about things like improving skills, inequitable outcomes. We might be talking about like longer term labor market outcomes or post-secondary. We also are often talking about constrained resources. We talk about the fact that students are behind. There are these major inequities within our system. We're trying to provide additional supplemental instruction and support to help students catch up, but we're doing that with limited, very limited constrained resources. So many proposals do have these references in the justification section. What really is needed is to then think about how that is setting you up to talk about your cost piece and how your cost piece actually will help you to inform that justification with your results. Okay, so you'll talk about the program or the assessment or whatever it is that you're studying or developing. You'll review prior literature, right? Please consider a way to discuss what you are thinking of as business as usual. It's so helpful to show your reviewers that you are thinking about that in advance. Here you have a theory of change, right? And it's showing how you have some areas of resource allocation or resources that will go into this approach, and it'll highlight which ones are likely really important for your study based on the literature, based on the design. IES is asking that we set out our primary or secondary outcomes. The SREE registration system is pushing us in a similar direction. I think this is good. It's difficult because we know that there are sometimes getting to reading comprehension, there are so many outcomes along the way, so many smaller skills or pieces of literacy development that really go hand in hand, but each is maybe its own separate aspect of learning to build toward literacy, to build toward reading comprehension. And in doing that, we want to focus on the piece that we see as being broken. So what my charge to you is in your proposals is make that really clear, make it clear which outcome you're focusing on and why, so that then when you make it to the cost effectiveness section, you'll have a plan at the design phase for how you plan to handle that section. You're also going to establish a design where you think about research questions, your logic models, sampling, random assignment. In your research questions, consider costs. Your logic model will likely include resources. In your sampling, you've got to think about sampling for the study, and then you think about random assignment, and then you think about sampling for the implementation study and for the cost study. So in your proposal, for personnel, it does also ask reviewers to see, check the personnel section. Are they clear about who's going to run different components of the study? Do they have experience or expertise in that area? Does it look like they have support from a panel of advisors or different areas like that? And the cost piece has been translated into that piece of the proposal review. So reference training that you or someone on your team or others on your team have had in economics, cost effectiveness, benefit cost analysis, this webinar, other things like this that you've consumed or benefited from, or you've been trained through. You might also reference experience in conducting an economic evaluation for your team members, or having a cost study, right, that maybe was embedded in a field trial or other work that you've done. So in terms of what you have available to you between now and August, right? I know that the amount of resources or the amount of skill that you're able to develop between now and then is really limited. One thing that I encourage you to do in your proposals is to just show your reviewer that you're planning to continue to build your skills in this area, that you're going to seek out resources, and you might list some of them. You might list the training program. There are other materials available too, but you could talk about that in your proposal to signal your genuine investment in this component of your study, right? It's not just how you thread the cost throughout, but then also saying, I'm planning on continuing to build the skill in this way. You might have a partner, right, like a sub-award or a person who really takes on the cost study component that you bring into the team, who works with you. That might be something sort of as needed, right? Or if you have an expert advisor, always make sure to include your letter of support, clarify how the team will work together, especially in the COVID lifestyle that we have going. So talk about those systems of how you work with your team, and include the cost person or whomever it is on your team that's going to be working on these different components in that discussion. And you also want to make sure that your budget, your research plan, your timeline, right, these things align with these different people that you're talking about or people's skill. So it should just be really clear that the personnel section and the budget flows together, right? So you wouldn't want in the personnel section to say that you've got a person with you, but then that's not really reflected in your budget, or vice versa, right? In the timeline, you would want to make it clear that if you've got an expert panel and people are going to be reviewing the work, like when you're going to send that work to them. Simple ways to just create this alignment can make a very big difference. Okay, so in the RFA, as you all are probably familiar from IES, there's the grant types are listed there on your left. And then on your right, there's information about where costs are either encouraged or required. So we're going to talk today about measurement. We're going to talk about development and innovation at the end, and we're going to talk about initial efficacy or efficacy follow-up, or potentially effectiveness if you're doing that either from prior funding or from a different source. We'll talk about those in the middle. Now, the reason why development's coming last is because the development piece is really very similar to an efficacy piece in terms of the framing, right? When you're just thinking about what you're delivering during the pilot. You're not costing the development, you're just thinking about what's delivered in the pilot. But we'll follow up with that at the end. Okay, let's jump into measurement. So here, as we said earlier, we're thinking about the cost or like the resources, right, that are needed to deliver the measure that you've developed successfully. If the assessment comes as a kit, right, if you purchase it, you might say like what comes with the kit, and then you might, here is where it's really helpful, is to build upon that information with any sort of other materials or manipulatives, rewards, stickers, right, you name it. What else is needed for this assessment to be delivered? Right, we want to make sure that it's really clear and we're setting up our practitioners to do this successfully. So specify how it's going to be delivered. You're probably already doing this, right? When we think about, is it one-on-one, is it small group, is it whole class? Those have obvious cost implications. Is it provided during class or pull out? Is it paper and pencil or computers, right? And thinking about the other materials that we need. Who's going to deliver the assessment? Is this something that a teacher does on a pull-out basis while students are busy doing other activities? So they sort of do things on like a 10-minute basis with different students throughout the course of the month? Or is this something where the school district has a psychologist who visits each school and spends some time with each school, right? So being clear about that, being clear about the special training or experience that the people need to have to deliver your assessment well. In terms of taking that information and putting a dollar value on it, the CBCSE cost tool, it's called Cost Out. It's pretty simple to use. It allows for pretty simple calculations like this. You can easily put in a set of resources, a set of quantities, and there'll be the national average prices that we really quickly talked about earlier. We have a database there that pulls information from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and NCES and other sources like that, so that you can have national average prices there available for you. So that could be a really easy way to do that. In this, right, I mean, just don't lose sight of the fact that teachers' time is important. Even if a teacher is salaried through the school system, if that teacher is purchasing stickers, or if that teacher is taking time to work out scheduling for an assessment, we really want to make sure that we're capturing that as either a cost that's borne by the teacher or a cost that's borne by the school, because the teacher's time isn't infinite, it has value. And if we want them to do this well, we need them to know that they need to invest that time to do your innovative assessment. Here's a really quick example of what this might look like at the end. So let's say an early childhood executive function measurement tool. Okay, let's say it takes 10 minutes per child. We're going to do this with 3 classrooms and 25 children, okay, and it's delivered by an aide. Let's say, as you can see in the table, I apologize, my mouse is like totally not showing up, so I can't point for you, but if you just look at the table, the aide would have some training time, and then the aide would have time to deliver the assessment across the 3 classrooms. It's delivered with 1 tablet with an app that's purchased. And so then here we'll see it separate from the quantity. We've got prices that show the market rates of these different ingredients. We translate that into costs, and then we have an average cost per student. Now, when we think about this, right, just to remember, we always think too about distribution when we think about total cost. So here, about 93% of the costs of this measurement tool is a fee for the assessment. The remaining 7% is something that the school is going to have to reallocate or potentially hire or purchase to make this work. Okay. Like I said, that is not information that you all need to have at the start. That is not what you need to have right now. That's where you're headed. So it's really important for your reviewers is to see that you have a plan, right? You have a plan that you're going to create this beautiful thing, and you're going to share this beautiful thing with the world, and you're going to share information about how to do that in the way that you've designed and in the way that you intend for it to be delivered. So that's the expectation. So don't get too overwhelmed with what this should include. Instead, just think about it as making sure that you're equipping your future users with information about how to do this well. All right, so efficacy and effectiveness. All right, in your research plans, there's often three main components. You've got effects, you've got implementation or fidelity, and you've got costs. Now, what I recommend is that you think about how these three build on one another. Already said that. But in these, you're going to have research questions, you're going to have data, you're going to have methods, and I think you're going to be best off if your costs are reflected in all three. Must-do items. So here is what I'm talking about, trying to be laser focused, super efficient, trying to give you some helpful tips without going too far into the weeds on terminology or methodology or things like that. Include a research question. When you say, what is the effect of my new curriculum on this particular student outcome? And then you say, was my intervention delivered with fidelity? And then you say, what was the cost of my new curriculum to improve these outcomes or to affect these outcomes? All right, so have a research question there to reflect that this is a component of your study that is integrated with the rest of it. Do specify a method. If you're using the ingredients method, if you're using the textbook, get that citation in there. Outline the data collection on ingredients or resources that you're planning to observe during implementation. Right? Consider treatment contrast. We're going to spend a little time on treatment contrast today to make sure that that's something that you're fully able to really work with in your proposals. And again, that kind of goes back to where we started, thinking about your business as usual. Clarify the sample. Okay, so you've got a sample that you're using to estimate effects. Are you going to estimate costs based on that whole sample? How will you ensure that your costs correspond to your effects? In that way, you often talk about implementation. You might say, we're going to conduct a survey of all teachers, and then we're going to do follow-up interviews with a portion of those teachers. In that tool, in that measurement, you could also be collecting information about costs, so that you have some costs from all sites, and then maybe you have more in-depth information from a few sites. Think about that process and how that allows your costs to reflect the production of effects, or how that might create a cost estimate that really doesn't correspond to your effectiveness estimate. Outline a plan to estimate the cost value. Okay, I recommend the national average prices, but you might use some other price value. Specify that, talk about like your constant, that you'll use a constant year, you'll inflate or deflate, whatever you need to do. It's good to reference if you've got multiple years of a program that's multiple years of the dosage, where a student receives multiple years, how you'll handle that with a present value. And then in terms of specific ingredients like the tablet, like you may have noticed in the table for the measurement group, the tablet was priced at a per year value, right? So we only want to reflect the amounts of resources we're using during the time in which we're delivering this intervention. So there are some pieces to that, the adjusting the costs piece, that you do want to have a few references in there just to show that you're prepared for that piece of it. Plan for sensitivity tests. If you know that you've got volunteers, if you know that you've got some rural sites, some urban sites, if you know that you might have some differences in implementation that would have like pretty significant resource implications, like maybe in some sites you've got people giving tutoring who have reading specialist certifications, and then in other sites, the people giving tutoring are parents And in that situation, you might expect to see differing effects. And in that case, you would want to test for that with your costs also to see if any of your assumptions make a big difference in how you're estimating costs. All right. It is important to say that you will consider existing research. You do some of that in your proposal already, but in the work that you're planning to produce, you can talk about how you plan to continue to survey the literature and situate your findings, because some of them are going to be, 5 years plus from now. How you're going to situate that in the literature that's available, or that has become available since the time of your proposal. Include these activities in the timeline. When you do your Gantt chart or your sheets with we're doing all these activities, right? We're collecting these data, we're administering these assessments, we're getting this information from the districts. That should include the data for your cost study. It should include the estimation of costs. It should include the reviews, as I mentioned earlier, with the personnel, right? You want to make sure that this is really threaded throughout and clearly an aspect of your study that you're thinking about. Okay, so here's just a few research questions, ideas to help you get started. This does not need to be complicated. It's not meant to be complicated. In fact, the method is really meant to be as simple as possible. Now, just like you would try to have a pretty simple, straightforward question on your effects, you want something similar for the cost. What's the total cost of some intervention to produce this outcome or to produce changes in Y? It's also important, as we've already covered, talk about how those costs were financed. If you're looking at an intervention or a particular approach that's delivered within schools, that would be delivered by schools on their own going forward, I highly suggest you consider the costs borne by the school. And then also think about other resources that are being leveraged, right? This is an incredible thing when we're able to leverage community-based organizations or parent or caregiver time, other volunteers to come in and enrich the experiences of our students. We want to make sure that we're clear about how that breaks down from the total cost estimate into these different contributing agents. All right, if you know that you're going to have some variation in implementation, you know that you're going to have some variation in your effects probably due to that variation in implementation, you can go ahead and say, well, how are my costs varying by site? Are they varying in ways that seem associated with my variation in effects, or they varied in ways that are important for the cost estimate? The more you can sort of think about the theory of change of your intervention at the design phase, the more you can set up your study to look at these other kinds of questions beyond just what's the total cost or the average cost. Now, given that IES is specifying this cost effectiveness piece, and we're trying to make sure that we understand that we're using a cost effectiveness framework to estimate costs that produce an effect, but they also really want to see those two things together in a ratio. They want to see costs and effects together in a ratio. An important piece of that ratio is that as a metric, it on its own is not useful. As a metric, it is intended as inherently comparative. It's meant to be compared among other alternatives. So in an efficacy trial, you could mention also, how does the cost effectiveness of this intervention compare to alternative interventions that affect equivalent outcomes? And so there you would replace that with your own language, right? To alternative interventions that affect reading comprehension in 5th grade, that's what we said before, or student algebra skills at the end of 8th grade, or what have you. Here's a few just pro tips. If you can, integrate data collection. I've alluded to this a little bit earlier, but integrate data collection on your ingredients into the implementation study. The fewer times you can go back to your practitioners and ask them for what they did and when they did it and how things went, the better, right? So when you go and you ask them about, if they're using the training materials that they received, and if they're getting support from their supervisor or from the principal or whomever. You could also ask them about some of their time allocation, or you could ask them about their credentials if you don't already have that information. Okay, tip number 2, alignment, right? We've already talked about this. We don't have to say much here. If you expect heterogeneity, consider that in your cost study design. And critical, obvious one, we've already said this a bunch, specify treatment contrast. The more you can do these 3 things in your proposal and integrate costs throughout, it's just going to be easier for it to be a home run for your reviewers. Now, a great paper, I just love this paper from Mike Weiss, Howard Bloom, and Tom Brock. It's a JPEM paper. Sorry, Liz. That's
okay.
Dree has my heart. So it's a really great paper because it sets up a really nice framework for thinking about the production of effects and thinking about the production of effects that vary, right? And all the different ways that we go from a treatment that we've designed, and we have like this in theory implementation of what our business as usual is and what's going to work, and how we move that into actual reality, and then how that's producing an effect. And all the different ways in which our context or the population that we're working with might influence that process and the effects that we end up measuring in the end. So we're going to spend a little time with this example because it's just such a good teaching tool. So here is where we start. Here's where we are right now, right? As we're sprinting into August, we know what we're studying. We have a planned treatment. There's an implementation plan, right? Hopefully we're able to say something about the business as usual situation that we're going to deliver this in. You can, at this point, start to list the ingredients that you know from your theory of change and from the program as designed that will go into delivering the approach, right? If you know that you're going to have volunteer tutors, you can list volunteer tutors, right? You can just start to specify this list. And as you do that, you can create a worksheet. Now, this worksheet is a little different from the worksheet that you had before, largely columns C and D, where we think about the questions that you may need to ask to get the data that you need on different ingredients. You might also then list the source of information where you could get those data, right? So if you know, I really need to know from teachers if they spent a lot of time outside of school interacting with parents in the treatment group or the control group to see if maybe the treatment group changed how teachers are interacting with parents. And in this case, if you have a survey that's asking teachers about their interaction with parents, here you could list the questions that you need about parent time, about the teacher time, and you could have the source as the survey. Now, this is not something that at the design phase, I or anybody else expects you to have all of it ready. The goal here is that you could just start thinking about this information at the design phase so that when you talk about your data collection activities, you're talking about things in an integrated way where you say, we're planning to conduct surveys, or we're planning to do time logs, we're planning to have interviews, and in those different data collection activities, we plan to measure information regarding implementation fidelity, and cost or resource allocation. What you can do, though, is once you're funded, you can come back to this. I highly recommend coming back to this at the start of your study and really doing this fully all the way through. So then that way you know like which source, where you're getting which data, right? So in the end, you can pull things together more easily. Okay, so that gets us through like this first box way over here on the left, right? The dark box. That doesn't really get us into right what's happening, right? Where we might have some differences happening in implementation over time. So as I mentioned, that box is based on this idea of theoretically relative, like our expected relative strength between the treatment group and the control group. And although most of our studies have not really talked about this, this is something that we're just implicitly doing and that we need to make more explicit for our audiences. And so here we sort of start out with this contrast, this idea of contrast. But what we know, though, is that the treatment group, there's often infidelity in all different kinds of ways, and that we do try to capture that with our implementation studies. What we also need to be considering too, though, is that how our control groups might also be doing something different from what we imagined in the beginning, or maybe imagined is not the nicest word, what we theorized as happening in our control classrooms in the beginning. We want to make sure that we're able to move to this idea of an achieved strength or an achieved contrast, and that our cost estimate reflects that contrast, right? So if we go back to the Weiss paper, it's this process where we have this contrast between these two groups that we really want to reflect, and we want to make sure that we can have our cost estimate in the end correspond to our effect estimate. In that process, be careful not to overlook mediators. Now, mediators also involve resources, okay? So it isn't just about the production of the output or the outcome or the effect. It's also about, added or potentially cost savings and resources that occur along the way. So in this case, right, it might be that we've got an early intervention treatment for children with autism. And let's say we're really aiming high with the goals that the field was sort of established by with early intervention, that we want as many kids as possible to be prepared to enter kindergarten with very limited supports. And then we want to follow up with those kids. We want to see how they're doing. How are these children doing in first grade and second grade and third grade? An important piece to that as we look at these longer term outcomes is also thinking about changes in services that mediate those outcomes, right? So if we have prepared children to enter kindergarten where they need fewer services that would be relevant for that they would have received had they not been in the treatment, and we're looking at outcomes after that, right, then those are cost savings that we would want to make sure that we factor in. Similarly, if we're looking at high school students and we're looking at post-secondary completion, there are other different college enrollment, other potentially needing like services in college for, I'm losing my word, I apologize, but like when you need remediation in community college or things like that, like maybe we're adding costs by sending students to college, but maybe we're saving costs by making them more prepared, right? So we can just think about these mediators as we move through. And this is really where some of these evaluations do get more complicated. Okay, so really super fast, we've got, I'm just going to share with you some information about an efficacy trial that I've been working on for the last 4 years, but in it, some of you may have seen this previously, so it does include some results to try to give you a sense of where you're headed. So that was the goal with this. Zoology 1, or it's called ARC Core now, it's from the American Reading Company. Basically, it's a literacy program that integrates science to curriculum. And so the literacy block that students receive as part of just typical business as usual practice is replaced with the Zoology 1 or ARC Core literacy block, right? So we know that we've got a certain contrast that we're working with. We have a sense of where we might need to hone in on our data collection activities based on this contrast and based on the theory of change for the curriculum. We collected data from the program. So from the program, we could have information about, some information about like volume of reading to have a sense of how that was varying across classrooms, but also the coaches were incredibly involved and important in this piece. So we had information about the coaches and their caseloads and things like that. We did teacher surveys, we did time logs, to try to get a sense at teacher time and to get a sense of parental investment. Now, the reasons for doing that is that when we started out at the design phase, right, we did this listing of our ingredients and we sort of honed in on, well, with materials, right? You'll see right there in the middle, we sort of know what's happening with materials. The kids are, the classrooms that are in our treatment group are going to get a kit. We know that there's going to be some PD. We know that there's going to be some coaching. But we know that the model really hinges on a couple inputs. The teaching time in the classroom, increasing and expanding that amount of time from maybe what was like a standard literacy block, and then volume of reading, carrying that culture of literacy into the home with home reading. So we knew that we would need to focus on those two aspects in our data collection efforts. So then as implemented, we were able to see that, as sort of expected, we did have some differences in those two ingredients in the quantities that they were delivered in during the course of the trial. So this just helps provide pretty basic descriptive information about implementation from a resource perspective. So then we turn that into a table with cost information, where we're thinking about the treatment group and the control group. So because, again, it was a replacement curriculum, we want to think about differences in teacher time. Well, what we found is that we didn't really see a difference in teacher time. The literacy block was the literacy block. The teachers were delivering basically the same amount of instruction across both groups. So you'll see we don't have a cost value attached to that because there was really no change in the amount of time. We did see about a doubling in the home reading that was assigned by teachers and then completed by parents. We were not able to go out and collect data from parents themselves. So we had to, again, make some proxies, talk to teachers, and those are limitations that we note. But again, with your scope, you're not expected to be able to collect data from every individual, or do interviews with every individual or anything like that. It's mostly focusing on areas where you have resources that are likely to be costly or that are likely important for the production of the output or the production of the effect. And then thinking about how you include those in the study. All right, so then we take our costs, we have them, it's running in that column sort of toward the middle, total cost. And then next to it, you'll see this piece about distribution. So here our total cost per student is on average about $480. So that's like the total value of the resources that went into producing this effect. On the distribution side, you'll see the costs that are borne by the school, and you'll see costs that are borne by the home. Now, interestingly, under materials, and you'll see this in the total cost in the school column, we found some cost savings. So in the design, right, we knew in the theory of change that the curriculum was intended to be comprehensive. It was intended to fill the literacy block where where teachers wouldn't need to have sort of a stacked or puzzly type literacy block where they're using many different types of approaches and supplemental curricula and lots of different resources pulled from different ways, where that wouldn't be the case, right? So the idea was, it's not like we've got writing over here and we've got read alouds over here, and we've got like blends and phonics and things like this over here. Instead, it has it all together. So we knew that we did want to also look into, well, what other programs are they using in the classroom? Did the classrooms with Zoology 1 use all those same all the same other supplemental literacy supports that they would have used without the program, or did they in fact cut back? And so that we're comparing Zoology 1 to classrooms with like lots of other programs going on. And so what we did find is about a difference of 3 on average across these classrooms that do have cost implications. So we had to include that there in the cost savings, which was interesting. But then you'll see in the distribution, we've got about 2/3 of the costs are coming from the school and about 1/3 of the costs are coming from the home. Okay, so I'm going to pause there And let's see where we are on questions.
Great, thank you. There actually are some questions, so this is perfect. The one, you've sort of touched on this, but the one I want to ask first is about sort of the trade-off on estimating incremental costs versus total costs. You know, for example, this is what the question said, for example, not costing out use of a school room that would be available anyway. So I think this builds nicely on what you were just talking about. So if you could just expand on that a little bit.
Absolutely. So I got to tell you, I think, so part of the reason, okay. I think some of the terminology that we're using right now, it was originally intended to help make this process clearer for non-economists. But I think in the end, today, we're using some competing terms. So a cost is intended to reflect inputs to produce an outcome, and in some cases, that's inherently incremental. The use of total cost and incremental cost today, I find to be a little confusing, and I think that we need to clarify that from the methodology side of things. Now, what's important is when we think about providing cost information or resource information about implementation. So when we think about like this table here, this information is really reflecting what we're expecting to deliver and then what we observed during delivery. This is implementation, but just from a resource perspective. When we move into cost, right, we're costing the things that are different that produce the impact. Now, I understand that that is probably still somewhat confusing and murky, and I apologize about that. It's something that we're hoping to clarify, but I think as long as in your proposal, if you focus on getting the information that you need and then producing a cost estimate that corresponds to your effectiveness estimate, which in some cases is going to need a net estimate like this, where maybe we subtract treatment from cost from treatment. You can talk about those things without bogging yourself down in terms that might be a little bit confusing. So another issue with incremental is that incremental means like above and beyond. However, in a study like this, in many of our studies, we might be likely to find cost savings or a shift or a replacement or a reallocation where it's not really above and beyond. So I just encourage you all to think really carefully about the audience that you're serving, about how you can reflect the components of the intervention, the implementation, and then estimating costs based on that. Liz, are there other questions?
Do we cost out the actual research evaluation costs like the survey admin team?
What a great question. No. So really what the cost is intended to reflect, right, that production of the effect. So I know I keep using these very cold, you know, production line type words. But the reason is because of this diagram, right? So you think about what's influencing the treatment, what's influencing the control, what resources are being delivered by each. Now, in the development of an intervention or in the evaluation teams in an efficacy trial, the evaluation team's role, sometimes these lines get blurred, and it's really good that you're picking up on some of that. So in a case where the line might be blurred is where if you're going out and you do interviews, if you observe teachers and you do interviews with them, and then in that process, you provide them with feedback about how they did during the observation and where they could improve their practice. In that case, that researcher is improving the practice of that teacher and is serving as a coach. And so in that way, that researcher's time would need to be included because they're officially sort of an input in this process, right? They're part of what's driving that teacher's effectiveness. In other cases where a researcher may sort of come in and out, collect some survey information, and the survey doesn't in any way provide feedback on performance, it's provided to treatment and control, right? That is just a research tool that would not go into the cost of to produce the effect. But that is one that can be murky in our efficacy trials, where we have often, like, we're very present in those schools. And we might create, so I've sort of, I like the term like evaluation environments, where if we have, research assistants in the building, if we ourselves are in the building, especially if the relationship is really one where there's a power dynamic, and the school is really responding to the attention that they're receiving by being in the treatment, right? Those kinds of things, I think we need to note. When it isn't something that we can say like directly influence the implementation in a way that we can measure, but we do know that there was this environment, there was this excitement, maybe parents were rallied around the fun of being in the study or something like that. Those are good things to note. It creates buy-in, which is a wonderful thing, but it's also important for those who are trying to replicate your work to know, hey, I need to get buy-in around this. Like, what are some ways we could leverage buy-in? It might not be around a field trial, but it would be buy-in for this great program that we know will be successful, or that we know was successful for students previously. All right, Ellen, anything else?
Yeah, there's about 10 questions. So
that's so many.
I'm going to start with the oldest, and some of these you might answer, in which case you can just say move on. Will we go over strategies on how to cost out benefits of the program measurement?
Oh no, Ellen, say it again.
Will we go over strategies on how to cost out benefits of the program measurement?
Oh, okay. How to cost out the benefits of the program's measurement. Okay, I cannot promise that I completely understand the question, but here's what I'll do. In terms of economic benefits, right now IES is not requiring the inclusion of economic benefits in any aspect of the studies that are proposed. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. What you could talk about in terms of a measurement tool, when you talk about in the justification section, either for like a new assessment or for an efficacy trial, right, you might be talking about long-term benefits to taxpayers or to society or to these students that we're serving. When you're doing that, you're talking about returns. So you could potentially also include an estimate of like the economic benefits. You might also do that in a less intensive way, where you sort of talk about what's already in the literature and sort of situate it within that. You could either do that as you propose or in your findings. And I'm happy to. I hate that we can't get to all the questions because I love the discussion in these meetings. So what we can do is I'll get a transcript of these questions, but if you want to follow up with me via email, that is completely welcome. It is hectic and crazy and emails get lost. So if I don't respond to you, just resend it, right? Bump it back up in the inbox. I'm more than happy to try to think through some of these murkier issues with you guys.
Brooks, do you have additional slides you plan to present?
I do have a couple more.
Okay, let me ask one more question and then we'll go to the slides.
That sounds good.
IES is really into statistical precision and power, but it seems that a pretty good cost study might be based on a couple interviews per site describing what went on there. There's no standard error around that or ability to know how precise it is. Is that okay? What do you suggest to support that our measures are precise or generally accurate, given that we can't survey every teacher probably?
Okay, great question. That is an area of the field that we want to advance, and until we are able to have more studies, to do more methodological studies on, we're at a point where we don't have really specific requirements around like using what Niambo Dong has done and Rebecca Maynard around like power for cost effectiveness, or thinking about there is a way using Filler's theorem to estimate confidence intervals around cost effectiveness ratios. So there are ways to think about the variation that we observe in cost, but unless we have a rich set of data to do that, you're totally right. Like that's not something that's easy to do. We can use bootstrapping, right? There's some ways that we can look at like the sensitivity of the numbers that we're producing. With costs, we know that there are some elements in an intervention or in an approach that are going to really drive the cost value, right? So personnel is expensive, especially if we're having like a one-on-one situation where the cost per kid is going to be pretty high because the kid's getting individualized services. So think about that, right? Focus on the areas where if you get that cost estimate wrong, if you get that quantity wrong, that how your result would be off. You would be like largely off. So if you really focus on some of those bigger, larger elements, you're going to be in better shape. And that's where Hank has always had this, Professor Levin, he's always had this really fun statement, like we don't count paper clips. It's really not the intention. And so here, when you think about data collection, I do not recommend having a cost study that only relies on 2 interviews or something like that, where you're not likely to have a cost estimate that corresponds to an effectiveness estimate. Now, if you were to do that in a pilot or a development study, that's a different scenario, right? There we're trying to sort of capture how costs might vary in a pilot. We'll talk about that next, I'm realizing. But in terms of within an efficacy trial, the call from IES is so that our costs reflect the effects, that they match, they correspond to one another. So that's where that sampling piece comes in, right? You wouldn't want to put a cost of resources to produce an effect. You wouldn't want to put a cost value into a ratio with an effectiveness value when those 2 numbers don't correspond to one another. So at the design stage, the expectation is that you will collect information to reflect what happened during the delivery of the intervention in the hopes that you do end up with a cost estimate and an effectiveness estimate that can be put together into a ratio. At the end of the day, there could be things that come up, just like in any study, right? Where, I mean, on the effectiveness side, there's so many things that lead us down different paths from what we had sort of originally thought we were going to be able to do. Costs could be similar in that way as well. Some interventions that we think that we're going to test actually need a year of like piloting and development with the district that we're partnering with. And in that case, you know, what we end up producing and the cost to produce that, that process becomes more messy and it's not quite like what we proposed. But at the proposal phase, what's really important is showing that you have the plan and that you are equipping your study to provide the results that are necessary for the costs and the effects to go together. Okay.
Thanks, Brooks. This is Liz. Sorry for my technical challenges, but I'm back. I just wanted to flag, we have a few kind of operational questions that I want to make sure to take a couple minutes for at the end. So if you want to go back to your slides for like 5-6 more minutes, and then we'll just turn to some final things, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
So development pilots, right, they're very similar to what we already talked about with efficacy because it involves a small scale study of the intervention. So here we're not focusing on the development of the thing, like those are, and from an economic perspective, those are sunk costs. What we really are worried about is what goes into delivering the thing to produce the outcome, right? So just like we said with the researchers going in and influencing delivery or just going in and collecting data, this would be a similar situation where you might look at how resources are being delivered. Now, in this way, for a development study, this information isn't just something that you could think about like in terms of a dollar value, right? This is also something that we would think about in terms of variation or how it changes during implementation that might also feed back into future development and continued exploration of this particular approach. So there's this really useful component of the resource implementation aspect. But then also it's important too that, you know, if you've really, you know, hit a home run and it's successful and then you want to move into an efficacy trial, you've set yourself up in a way for you or for others to run that efficacy trial with some expectations around how to implement the program that you've developed, but then also how to focus their efforts and how to study it well. Okay, so I know like you might be like yawning or you might be roaring, either one. It's a lot, and I know it's a lot, and it's fascinating. I was talking with Liz before that somehow in an hour and a half, it's like this is way too much information for an hour and a half, but it's also like not nearly enough information for the task that you all are trying to achieve. So I know that that's the situation, but what I do want to do is continue the conversation and to continue to provide guidance and support based on your needs. Are there any specific pilot questions, Liz, or should we jump to the others?
Let's jump, if you don't mind, let's jump to some like operational questions. Does that work? Mostly, I think it sort of builds nicely on your comment. For example, people have questions about whether they can use your slides in a course with proper attribution, of course. That was one quick question.
Sure. I mean, I think as long as there's attribution, right, as long as there's a reference, just like you would for any other set of slides, I guess I'm okay with that. Yeah. I think, you know, what's important is making sure that whomever it is that you're providing the training to also looks at the resources that this is based upon. But yeah, that'd be fine.
Great, thank you. So that actually builds on the next question, which is, will the participants, the attendees today have access to the worksheet templates? Those look very useful. Is there a open source to find those?
Absolutely, yes, I can make those available, yes.
Great.
We can send those with the email response where I'll send the other things, but the worksheets, yeah, absolutely.
Perfect. And then more broadly but related is people were wondering if you could comment on the most, this might be a tough one, more just for you to think about for the email. What are the most useful open access resources for cost and cost effectiveness analysis?
What are the most useful open access resources? I had hoped to follow up from this with information about various resources. I do think a lot of the materials out there, rightfully so, are trying to help make sure that we're clear on terms. We're thinking ahead about comparability. Between now and like your sprinting to August deadline, I think what's important is that you really make sure that you're checking off all the boxes. Whether you're using what I've put forward here or other standards documents or other guidelines that IES has produced. I'm not sure, there's an article from Hank Levin and Clive Belfield that was published in SREE in 2015 that talks about comparative cost effectiveness, but then thinking about costs and effects as we build toward comparative, and how there's some complexities there that we could be thinking about. But yes, there are some things available out there, but mostly just try to get to your proposal, and then we can continue to provide more.
That sounds right. My guess is your website and the email that will get sent out next week will be a huge help. Let me turn to one more content question, which I think is really relevant. The question, you know, I'm someone who straddles public health and education, so this one's sort of near and dear to my heart. The question was, what outcomes do IES reviewers consider acceptable to use as the effectiveness measure in a cost effectiveness analysis? Are QALYs or dailies required? So quality adjusted or daily disability adjusted life years required? My guess is no, but then the question is there an education equivalent to these health measures?
Okay, that is a great question. Largely because I have like a lot of opinions about it. So no, I mean, this year's RFA included the requirement or recommendation to include a primary effect with the expectation that you would pair costs with that outcome. And I think that it's helping us to move toward, something more like the registry and things like that, where we sort of set out in advance, like this is really our primary policy relevant outcome. Here are the other more proximal outcomes or other outcomes that we're going to measure, in addition to that, or then here are our secondary outcomes. Cost effectiveness as a framework, right? Because we want to put costs with effects into a ratio, it does push us in that direction. However, some of our studies don't have easily one outcome. So just as you mentioned in health, they do sort of a quality adjusted life year situation where they put a dollar value on an added amount of time that someone is able to live due to a treatment. In education, we do not do that. And I think rightfully so. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that you've got, like, let's say you're trying to improve 9th grade mathematics and you're trying to keep students engaged, aiming for high school graduation. And so maybe then you've got 9th grade mathematics and you've got high school graduation as your major marker outcomes. Those two outcomes are both policy relevant. There's no reason why you should ditch mathematics and only look at high school graduation, even though high school graduation has really great economic returns, right? We can look at that in a really nice way from an economic standpoint. Educators, everyone, like, we do still care about the skill development in mathematics. So I do not think that we should take this call to think about primary outcomes to say that we need only one outcome. Qualities, it's a whole other thing. I mean, it takes into account the utility that we attach to different outcomes, or that a decision maker would attach to different outcomes. I, as a researcher, feel that it is not my role to put my values into the research or into the outcomes that I'm presenting to the field. So that's like my soapbox, is I feel like utility and estimating those things for decision makers is not my job. If I was an analyst who worked for a policymaker, then I could talk with that policymaker in our local context to determine what our utility values are, maybe, and then do something like that. But from a very much like evaluator, national researcher perspective, I think it's a strong suit of education that we don't go down that road.
Great, thank you. And actually that touches on, there was a different question we didn't have time to get to on sort of multiple outcomes. And so actually your response, I think, nicely kind of touched on that too.
Yeah, yeah, Hank Levin had a chapter in 1975, and that sort of is what developed into the textbooks. In that chapter, he does talk about how you can just show, like, almost in a matrix, right? Like, you've got, here's your cost per student, but then here are the outcomes that we have. If you were to put these into different cost effectiveness ratios, you might have different efficiency metrics, like different economic metrics for how you might compare this program to another program. But then my argument is that our role is to provide them with that information and to let different policymakers, experts, and people within their own context use that information to make decisions.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great point to end on. This has been, an hour and a half flies by. I want to thank you so much for presenting. There were some other questions we didn't have time to get to, one of which was about staff acting as expert consultants from CBCSE. So maybe someone will reach out to you directly on that, or you can include that in the follow-up email. But thank you all so much. I'm thrilled that we had 100 attendees today, and I think this whole session will set people up really nicely for August and beyond. So a big thanks to you, Brooks, and for attending. Thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead, Brooks.
No, I just was going to say thank you so much for spending your lunchtime on a Friday with me. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Come back for the next one on Bayesian methods in a couple weeks, and yeah, enjoy the rest of the day and the weekend. Thank you so much.